Hello, everybody. My name is Nicholas Stevenson,
And I'm Jacob Burgraff.
and this is our ethics case study of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster.
So let's go over some of the facts first about the natural disaster and the initial reactor shutdown. On Friday, March 11th, 2011, a magnitude 9 earthquake hit eastern Japan, causing nearly 20,000 deaths across Japan. This earthquake took place about 80 miles off the east coast of Japan, causing a tsunami between 13 meters and 15 meters high, which swamped the Japanese coastline about an hour later. In response to the earthquake, reactors 1, 2, and 3 at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant shut down automatically using a gravity-actuated scram system to stop the fission reaction. However, the fuel inside the reactor stays hot for days to weeks after the fission process has stopped, so maintaining power to cooling systems for a long period of time is crucial. The earthquake immediately took the Fukushima plant off the grid, which activated the emergency diesel generators. However, the tsunami flooded the diesel generators, knocking all of them offline. Additionally, the backup batteries were flooded, which meant the reactors weren't receiving new cooling water. Due to heat buildup inside the reactors and power failure of gas venting systems, there were major hydrogen explosions in reactors 1, 3, and 4, which released significant amounts of radioactive material into the surrounding environment. This event led to the evacuation and displacement of nearly 100,000 people from the Fukushima prefecture and a cleanup effort that has so far cleared millions of tons of radioactive material. The area around the plant won't be at safe levels for habitation until the 2050s.
Now we understand the facts about the Fukushima event. We can understand who are the important stakeholders. So the first stakeholder is the people of Fukushima. They're the people that live around the area of the nuclear power plant. Next, we have the Japanese government. The Japanese government are the people involved creating laws and hiring companies to complete projects for the people. They also collect money from the people in the form of taxes. Third, we have TEPCO. TEPCO is responsible for designing, building, and running the power plant. And lastly, we have the workers of the power plant themselves. They work at the power plant.
So let's go over the motivations of the people of Fukushima. First and foremost, they want to return home and get back to their old lives. And the thing is that some have actually moved on and moved to other cities in Japan, but those who are looking to move back are sort of stuck in a limbo state where they want to rebuild their lives, but they kind of face years of wait time for proper decontamination of the Fukushima prefecture. Given how they've lost their homes, possessions, and have long-term side effects from the radiation exposure, they obviously want someone to blame and to provide them with compensation. And TEPCO actually paid about $40 billion in compensation to the Japanese government, about 16 billion of which was split evenly between the 85,000 evacuees, which comes out to around $188,000 per person. Now let's move on to the motivations of the Japanese government. They obviously want to minimize the loss of public property and life by evacuating the Fukushima prefecture. They also wanted to minimize the spread of the nuclear contamination as much as possible, so much so that they even considered evacuating Tokyo due to concerns about the spent fuel rods in reactor 4. The Japanese government, like any government, didn't want to look incompetent, so they ended up withholding some information for a while, but they later released it due to public pressure. Additionally, they didn't want to be blamed for the disaster, and they didn't want to bear the sole financial responsibility of cleanup and compensation. So after an investigation into TEPCO's actions, they found them guilty of negligence and other various ethical problems, and they fined TEPCO.
Now we're moving on to the motivations of TEPCO. So first and foremost, TEPCO wanted to minimize the total cost to increase the margins. They're a company, so they're focused on making money at the end of the day, and that's their primary objective, so that they can complete the job and do it in the most cost-effective way possible. They also desire to protect their image. Being a company in the Japanese society, they definitely thought of their image as something that represents them. And they wanted people to look at their company and respect their company and definitely hire them in the future. And lastly, they wanted to avoid costly lawsuits. By doing proper business, you can avoid costly lawsuits, or by silencing people or doing whatever they wanted to. They definitely wanted, at the end of the day, to have as least lawsuits and as cheap lawsuits as possible. So the next motivations we're going to be looking at are the motivations of the power plant workers. So first and foremost, they desired a safe working environment. Working in the nuclear industry can be considered as dangerous. So they wanted to minimize the risks to their health and their well-being while working in the nuclear plant. They also valued their jobs. This is how they put food on the table, and they definitely did not want to lose them. It's very important that they just keep their jobs and keep it in the most safe way possible. Lastly, they wanted to prevent a meltdown. That's their job at the end of the day, to keep the power plant up and running, generating energy, and to prevent it from failing, because that could be catastrophic. So the first thing we're going to look at involving ethics is the negligence by TEPCO. So firstly, TEPCO ignored safety concerns of fire whistleblowers. There were a few employees that reported things in the structural capabilities of the building and other problems they saw, and they were fired and silenced. And TEPCO decided to ignore their warnings, which is not very good. Also, these things were done to save money. They definitely did not think these problems were big enough to spend the money on, and they felt like it would be much better to not and save the money instead. And lastly, during the event, managers hesitated to order workers to let the seawater cool the reactors. So this is pretty unfortunate, because during the moment, it would have been better to let the seawaters cool the reactors, but they did not want to do that, and they hesitated to do that because the seawater would have damaged the reactors, and that would have cost them money in the long term. So they were very hesitant to do that, and by the time they managed to do it, it was already too late. This brings up an interesting ethical question about how, if workers should have the right to overwrite managers' authority in the cases of public safety.
So let's go over some of the inaccurate calculations that TEPCO made. So TEPCO made calculations in the 1960s, which estimated a wall height of 6.1 meters, and then again in 2008, which made recommendations for a new wall height of around 8.4 meters, which would still have been insufficient because the Fukushima tsunami was over 13 meters in height. Other plants actually had accurate tsunami height calculations, like the Onagawa plant, which was actually closer to the epicenter of the earthquake. This plant was unaffected by the tsunami because they performed correct tsunami height calculations, estimating a max height of around 13.6 meters. The key difference between how these plants made their calculations is based on the time frame of earthquakes they looked at for their worst case. The Onagawa plant used data from as far back as 1896, when a magnitude 8.3 earthquake hit Japan, while the TEPCO engineers used data from 1938, when a magnitude 7.8 earthquake hit Japan. The Fukushima plant was built in the 1960s, before the Onagawa plant, when seismology was a much less mature science. But this highlights the importance of annual risk assessments and rapid safety policy implementation based on those risk assessments. The bottom line is that TEPCO wasn't fast enough in upgrading the safety features of their plant, and they didn't do enough. So the accident could have been prevented if they hadn't been so lax on their improvements. Which brings up an interesting ethical question. Should TEPCO engineers have had their calculations checked by an impartial third party?
So the next implication we'll be talking about is the lack of emergency knowledge. Originally, the reactor in the power plants was bought from General Electric. So TEPCO didn't have the full knowledge of what the capabilities of these reactors were. This caused the unsigned engineers to not have a full understanding of the reactors, and it caused them to not be properly prepared when disaster struck. And this brings up a very interesting question of hiring qualified employees. Is it proper to have employees that are unqualified? Who gets to say who's unqualified and who's not, especially with something that involves public health and safety?
So the last part is the last fortification oversight. A last fortification is a failsafe for any kind of situation. In this case, the batteries were the so-called last fortification that would kick in if the plant was disconnected from the grid and if diesel generators were flooded. However, the batteries were placed under the flooding level during the tsunami, which led to a complete loss of power, which was not really considered as a possibility by the engineers. Thus, crucial safety components that kept the reactors cool failed. These components included seawater pumps and air exchange valves, which led to the meltdown and catastrophic explosions in 3 of the reactors. This raises an ethical question of, should the engineer that placed the backup batteries or the team of engineers that placed this backup batteries have asked senior engineers or more colleagues for advice? Should they have considered what would happen if they, if their fail-safe failed? So, yeah.
Lastly, we're going to be talking about the broken ethical codes. We decided to use the National Society of Professional Engineers codes to understand the situation and judge it by. These codes are very similar to the codes used in Japan. So the first code is to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public. We felt like TEPCO did not hold the safety, health, and welfare of the public in their minds. They mostly focused on saving money and doing the least amount of work. So we felt like they definitely violated that. Secondly, to issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. We feel like the government did not properly inform the people of what was going on in Fukushima, and that is definitely in violation of that canon. And thirdly, to conduct themselves honorably, responsibly, ethically, and lawfully so as to enhance the honor, reputation, and usefulness of the profession. We feel like TAPCO did not conduct themselves honorably and represent engineers properly because they did not properly adjust or fix the issues that were brought up.
Finally, we have a few overall ethical questions. To what extent are the engineers who designed the plant, TEPCO, and the Japanese government to blame for this disaster, and why? And is nuclear power worth the risk when human negligence guarantees a reactor or a meltdown like this in the future? And these are our sources here.
Thank you.
Thank you.